with linear narratives and ethnographic descriptions in which everything appears to be in place. As a former PhD student of Peter, I recall his eagerness to read about people's uncertainties, doubts, conflicts, conflicting emotions, as well as about inconsistencies between discourses and practices. Social life is messy, and a good ethnography should shed light to this messiness. This is what I learned as his student. There are so many reasons to be thankful to Peter, but this is one of the most important ones. Learning next to him how to be attentive to the ambiguities of life and how ethnography can capture complex articulations of sociality. His book, The Burials of Belonging, traces the rather different trajectories in the obsession with autochthony in Africa and Europe. While in Africa, notably in Cameroon, claims of autochthony emerged in the process of the country's democratization. In Europe, specifically in the Netherlands, the return to the local was a response to rising concerns over immigration. Peter's intention here is not to highlight the differences between these two contexts, but rather to emphasize their similarity, autochthony's strong emotional appeal and unexpected mobilizing force. Throughout his work, Peter Gesher has been committed to the use of comparison as an anthropological method. Through comparison, we can spot differences, but we can also raise questions as to what is common in human experience, cross-culturally and historically. In that way, Peter has used comparison to de-exceptionalize Africa and not to simply construe African societies as different. For example, in his latest book, Witchcraft, Intimacy and Trust, Africa in Comparison, he focuses on the link of witchcraft and sociality and compares practices from African societies with examples from Europe, Brazil, and Melanesia. A single focus on witchcraft may bear the risk of primitivizing Africa, of portraying it as the dark continent. But Peter's approach to witchcraft as a dark side of kinship and as a danger that comes from within allows him to raise the question of how people establish trust with people with whom they are connected. Therefore, approaching witchcraft as a form of aggression that comes from inside, as a danger of home, reflect human fears that are certainly not particular to the African continent. And as Peter claims in the last sentence of his Perils of Belonging book, we need common stories in order to live together. But these stories must address diversity and allow for conversation across differences. Basil and I are incredibly happy to organize this panel and appreciative that our panelists accepted our invitation to join us. On a more personal note, organizing this panel is for me the least way to express my gratitude to Peter for everything I've learned from him. Working together with him for more than a decade has saved me not only as a scholar, but also as a person. So thank you so much, Peter. And at this point, I think that Basil also wants to say a few words. I think, Basil, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for offering me this opportunity to say a few words about the man I consider both a mentor, a master, a father, and a godfather. I'm going to say something that I've never said so far about Peter Gesher. This is more than, I think, 25 or 26 years that I come to know him, but I've never called him by his name. I've never said his name, whether it's the first or family name. Because in the culture I come from, we don't say the father's name. We don't name the father. because the Father has no name. And like God's name, the Father's name is unspeakable because he's sacred. So saying the Father's name is tantamount to wanting to stand at his weight, to compare oneself to him. Says the Father's name is expressing the desire to inherit him even when he's still alive, and is to break the taboo. And in the Bantu culture, it can be seen as the act of parricide. That is a mystical mother of the Father. Since I cannot name his name, since I cannot say anything about this name, I can only call him Professor. And Professor here becomes a supplement of a name that cannot be named. It is what Derrida will call a surnom. A surnom for Derrida means a name that takes place, that take over or replace a name when he's absent, or when he cannot be named or mentioned. So I can only honor the Father by so naming him, by giving him a name that is above the name. By so naming him Professor, I do not only acknowledge my intellectual debt to the great scholar, but also express my commitment to keep alive this heritage that I share so much. Peter Gesher's work have been very inspiring also for my own work, and especially has shaped our understanding of globalization, citizenship, nationalism, and identity formation. For example, his now most cited book titled The Peril of Belonging is for me one of the most powerful deconstructive reading of globalization process. This book is a destabilizing critique of Antonio Appiah's celebrated rooted cosmopolitanism and global citizenship. What this book shows is that we assert or express our modern identity in ways that are deeply rooted, less in cosmopolitanism and globalism, but rather in localism, which means that in globalism, there's more localism than cosmopolitanism. There's more closure than flow or escape, and Appadurad will put it. So my reading of this now famous book is that it dismisses the illusion of global identity making, and by underlining the fact that we have never really been globalized nor cosmopolitan, as is commonly asserted. We are more what I call somewhere a localist or a cosmopolitan villager. And we all know that Peter Gesher's scholarship will always be connected to the village, especially he beloved Maka village, which is not far from the place I'm now actually. So again, I have to say my thanks to him for all what he has done for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basile. And also we are very honored that the director of NIAS is with us, Jan-Willem Davender, who also wants to say a few words about Peter Gesher. Jan-Willem.
Thanks, Apostolo. Just to say that indeed the Directorate of NIAS is not gonna speak in all sessions of this conference, but given that this panel is such a special event on a special occasion, honoring and celebrating the work of Peter Gescher, I'm very happy to say some words as well. The theme of your session, your two sessions, Belonging, Mobility and Exclusion, Comparative Perspectives from Africa and Europe, is not only an adequate description of the research field of Peter Gescher, but it also describes what Peter cares about people being excluded, forced out, on the run, moving to other parts of the world, longing to belong, wherever they are. There are others who can much better, and two of them already spoke, speak much better about his place among Africanists and his studies dealing with the African context. I know best Peter's impressive work on the similarities among developments in African and European countries, so well analyzed in the book already mentioned, Perils of Belonging, and other publications by his hand. When Apostolos and Basile proposed to organize two special panels dealing with Peter's approach of belonging, the negative, dangerous side, I immediately agreed. That is not only a wonderful fit with this conference, but we also need, as Apostolos already has emphasized, we need a comparative perspective to better understand the rise of autochthony, the rise of nativism around the world. I'm grateful to all of you who participate in these two panels, not only spanning continents, but also bringing in a historical approach to the study of belonging and nativism. And in this context, I just want to say how much I learned from Nandita Sharma's book, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, showing how colonization and decolonization have produced categories that colors our days so deeply. So I'm looking forward to her presentation in the second session. Slightly more personal. When we work together on our research project on deculturalization of citizenship with many others, among whom Evelien Tonkens and scholars presenting here today, I slowly started to understand that Peter not just embodies scholarship, but wisdom. Wisdom in the meaning of the quality of knowledge, the quality of being wise, but also the quality of having certain experiences, the quality of good judgment, and the quality to be inclusive. To be a mentor who often knows better and that he doesn't hide, but who can be direct and honest, but always caring, responsive, and showing responsibility for those who have not reached that wisdom yet. Peter, I'm grateful that we have worked together, and I guess that I speak on behalf of many people when I say that you made academia a better place, where many of us feel that we can belong because of wise and caring scholars like you. To belong without being exclusionary. Actually, you have shown that that is possible. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jan Willem. That was very nice to hear about Peter. I think we can proceed with our presentations. We have two wonderful papers by George Paul Mayo and Pamela Feldman Savelsberg in the first session. Amadem Charek was also going to participate in this panel, and as much as he wanted to do so, he's unable to join us today. So we will start with George's presentation entitled "On the Rhythms of Return: Sexuality, Temporality, and Belonging among Migrants in East Africa and Eastern Europe." George is currently in Romania, right? Yeah, so he has already sent us a pre-recording of his presentation. And after I play the recording, then he will join us for the discussion. Let me try.
Hello, everyone. My name is George Pomeu, and my presentation is entitled On the Rhythms of Return, Sexuality, Temporality, and Belonging Among Migrants in East Africa and Eastern Europe. In this paper, I reflect on intersections of sexuality, migration, and temporality comparatively in struggles over belonging in Kenya and Romania. Close ethnographic attention to these two contexts reveals some striking similarities in how migration and engagement in sexual economies shape and are shaped by pursuits of autochthonous belonging. In both contexts, young migrants often desire to return to their home village as a way to acquire respectability. And in both cases, this return entails building massive concrete houses, investing in rituals of kinship, and nervously trying to foreclose rumors and gossip that could undermine one's reputation. I wonder here, why these similarities? Why houses? Why rituals, among other things? And in seeking to address these questions, I noticed that time and temporality figure centrally in the dynamics of crafting and contesting belonging, especially when sexuality is key to the kinds of migration that is involved. Here I suggest concerns with the timing of the return, the durability of wealth and worth, or the pursuit of progress and modern futurities play central roles in what it means to belong to a people and a place. Between 2005 and 2017, my research in Kenya focused on young men of the Samburu ethnic group. Beginning in the 1980s, hundreds of young Samburu men have migrated some 900 kilometers south of their district to the Indian Ocean coast. There, they made a living in tourism, mainly seeking intimate relationships with female tourists from Western European countries. Throughout the following decades, men in relationships with white women became among the richest in their district. Returning to their home villages, they built houses, bought cars and cattle, and sought to invest in local customs associated with belonging, including bride wealth weddings and age set and clan rituals. But their return also gave rise to new conflicts, struggles, and conundrums. Were these men perverting customary practices and institutions because they pursue them through what locals called money of sex, that is, cash produced in sexual economies? Or were they setting an example of how to successfully acquire respectability and authority locally when other options had become less feasible? By the time I completed this project, I also found myself spending more time back home, back to my home, as it were, in my own home village in the Transylvanian region of Romania. My parents and I left Romania in 2003 to emigrate to Canada. I spent most of the following years living in North America. Now, in Romania, patterns of migration were somewhat different than the ones I had studied in Kenya. Since the 1990s, following the fall of the communist regime, Transylvanian youth have migrated in very large numbers to Western European countries, primarily Italy, Spain, Germany, and the UK, where they worked mainly in construction, agriculture, and elderly care. In Western Europe, a significant number of Romanians also engaged in sex work. Young migrant women and men sold sex, mostly to men, in Milan, Rome, London, and Berlin. Throughout the 2000s, most of these migrants returned to, and many young people began investing in home villages. This contrasted sharply with the 1990s, when people my age or older sought to move abroad more permanently. So why did these migrants, including those I worked with in Kenya, choose to return to their otherwise marginal villages? And what implications did this have for questions of belonging and autochthony? Now, this question brings me to one of the core arguments that Peter Gesher makes in The Perils of Belonging, that since the 1990s, African and European countries have witnessed a salient turn toward the local and the autochthonous. In both cases, questions such as who belongs and how can one establish belonging have become in light of either democratization, decentralization, or immigration. My research builds centrally on Gesher's work to ask how sexuality enters this equation of the turn to the autochthonous. What happens, for example, when people use sex to acquire the very means of respectability and belonging? Doesn't that somehow undermine the very possibilities to belong? So let me begin here by talking a bit about the Kenyan example. My book, Ethno-Erotic Economies, published in 2017, asks, among other things, what happens when Samburu recognize that the money that supports local lineages and pays for bride wealth locally is, in fact, money of sex? And how do male migrants deal with this recognition? First, let me talk a bit about houses back home. Large self-contained villa-type houses, often with 2-3 stories made of concrete, were one of the first media of wealth Samburu migrants sought to acquire through relationships with foreign women. Since the 1990s, such houses visibly transformed the landscape of highland settlements. Interestingly, the challenge for these men has been how to conspicuously display their wealth and claim authority and influence in the village while foreclosing the incessant requests of money that this wealth inevitably prompted. Poor Samburu families who now depended on migrants' money strategically deployed gossip about the money's origin in sex to undermine their respectability. Migrants themselves were quite anxious about the depletion of their wealth, either because they had to redistribute it to all these people, or because relationships with their white partners often ended quickly. This anxiety has animated the very ways in which the village house was built and inhabited. For example, men built houses with large fences and high gates, acquired watchdogs and watchmen, and typically left the house not by walking, but rather by driving from one house to another in their cars. All these strategies engendered a space-time in which incessant requests for material support from poorer villagers could be deferred, delayed. If large concrete houses were key media of durable wealth, the actual temporariness of this wealth led men to imagine new ways to prolong its life, to make it last by politely minimizing routes of redistribution. A second example I want to just briefly bring up is that of ritual economies. As more and more migrant men in their early 20s sought to quickly convert the money that they made at the coast in kind of respectability and belonging at home, including through marriages and access to the institution of elderhood, poor village elders now also devise new ways to deploy their ritual expertise to recirculate migrants' money. They prompted the idea that money of sex, otherwise a very polluting kind of currency, can, if diverted from individual consumption towards the collective good of the lineage and the clan, can in fact be cleansed and thus bring migrants respectability and recognition. Hence, a rush to redistribute this new money through the whirls of an expanding and inflating ritual economy, what I call a ritual rush to make a collective future happen. This engendered then, as I show in my book, a dialectic of ethno-capital, ethno-erotic capital, and autochthonous belonging in ways that made time essential. Let me turn now to the Romanian case. Here, because most migrants worked in construction or agriculture, those engaged in sex work could more easily conceal the origins of their money. Rumors, of course, still spread about these men and women being prostitutes, quote unquote. But like in Samburu, migrants also sought to foreclose these rumors by investing in parenthood, families, houses, and rituals. For example, young Romanian men engaged in transactional same-sex relations in Western countries often returned to the village to marry local women, have children, and seek respectability as patriarchs. Migrants' claims to belonging in the village thus played out through what Sasha Newell describes as an economy of the bluff, a certain kind of politics of pretense. With a few images from a fascinating visual anthropology project by Petruț Călinescu and Oana Hodoiu entitled Pride and Concrete, I want to illustrate two quick examples. First, again, the houses back home. Like in Samburu, Romanian migrants build imposing concrete houses that have drastically transformed the landscape of their villages. Often erected in the homestead of their parents or grandparents, these houses contrasted sharply with the older local styles. Such houses were also the first things parents encouraged their migrating offspring to acquire because they anchored their owners in the future of the village and also made important claims for the family's prestige. But here is an interesting twist in the story. Whereas on the outside, many of these houses were quickly completed and looked inhabited, even with curtains in the windows. On the inside, many of these houses were left unfinished and uninhabited for many years. In contrast to the Samburu case, where the display of wealth came with anxiety over others demanding redistribution of wealth, here the appearance of a majestic finished house that worked to raise the status of the family could at the same time offer a perfect excuse for not redistributing. So, you could ask for money, mostly your relatives who have migrants abroad, and an elderly family member could invite you in and say, my son still needs to finish the house on the inside. We do not have money at the moment to lend out or give out. So ambiguity and the bluff here are quite central to the production of belonging or the appearance of success. Secondly, ritual economies are important here as well. Participation in wedding ceremonies, for example, became central to claiming autochthonous belonging in many of these Transylvanian villages. Migrants tried to return to their villages at the very least once a year, every August, for weddings, and then every single day of the week there was a wedding happening in many of these villages, where they dressed in elaborate traditional attires and spent large amounts of money on this wedding exchanges. Weddings, too, presuppose something akin to what Newell has described for Côte d'Ivoire as faire le show, a certain kind of economy of the bluff in which families claimed local recognition and attachment through kind of conspicuous displays of wealth. Let me conclude. Both the Samburu and the Transylvanian migrants I describe here prefer to return to their otherwise marginal villages rather than establish themselves more permanently abroad or in the places where they worked. The value of money from abroad through conversion was much higher in these rural areas, while the otherwise peripheral position of the villages in the world economy made these migrants wealthy and influential people upon return. Yet returning to the home village did not automatically grant migrants acceptance or foreclose moral questions about the sexual origins of some migrants' money. Instead, this opened up new spaces of negotiation and contestation in which belonging was ongoingly claimed, performed, never a done deal. In the process, time and temporality played an important role. Here, belonging can be about struggles to synchronize the rhythms of competing calendars, to use a term introduced by Henri Hubert. Think here how the calendars of village weddings and ceremonies shape the timing of migrants' return, of how, as the Samburu case suggests, postponing encounters with poorer villagers might expand the lifetime of one's wealth, or of how, in the Romanian case, the appearance of success may buy one time to truly achieve such success. Think also of the ritual rush in both Samburu and Transylvania to convert migrant money in more durable idioms of kinship and prestige. And it is no accident that houses and customary rituals are key to the production of autochthonous belonging. Indeed, as generic categories, these, along with land and kinship, are globally recognized modernist media of durable attachment. But within these more generic categories, what emerges is also kind of a fertile ground of cultural innovation and the reimagination of what it means to belong autochthonous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. So let's continue with the second presentation by Pamela Feldman Savelsberg. Her paper is entitled is Perilously Reproducing Belonging, Transnational Cameroonians, Kinship and Disconnection. So Pamela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Apostolos. Thank you, George, for a wonderful presentation. And I will now share my slides. So as Apostolos said, I am a wordplay with both my work and Peg's work perilously reproducing belonging. I build on two of Peter's inspirational works, his book, Belonging, and his recent article, The African Family is Large, Very Large. Show how relevant they have been for my own research on belonging, mobility, and family making in and beyond Cameroon. I hope to demonstrate that deeply and meaning belonging illuminates related concepts like social reproduction, forms of capital, and forms of civilization. Like Peter, my research among Mongol Cameroonians consists that kinship are not only about conviviality, solidarity, and emotional connection, simultaneously are perilous fields involving ambiguity, disconnection, and exclusion. From my research among
I guess there is a problem with the connection. Let's wait for Pamela to reconnect. Can you hear us, Pamela?
I am sorry.
Okay.
Let me share again.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see now the slide that says place and people?
So I started.
Can you hear me?
With difficulty.
Yeah, okay. With difficulty, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the internet connection. So, I draw my research among largely Francophone Bamileke and largely Anglophone Western grassfielders. This research began in the 1980s in Bangante and Ndé division in Yaoundé and in the politically lively years of the 1990s and early 2000s, and among Cameroonian diasporas in Berlin, Paris, and South Africa. As evidenced by the fascinating thread, this has been used in a dizzying variety of ways. In my research on how Cameroonian mothers reproduce belonging through and for their children and deflect obligations for child fostering to manage belonging to kinship groups, I found it useful to distinguish the often acting dimensions of belonging. Belonging is the recognition by an attachment to a particular place or group. Belonging can be a status, either sought or imposed. For example, citizenship and national or ethnic identity simultaneously ascribed and achieved allow people to belong as members of the nation or ethnic group, who might submit to residency requirements, integration courses, and citizenship tests to gain a passport that can be recognized when it's good, whereas can be both but not recognized, to quote Bertolt Brecht from Flüchtlingsgespräche. Belonging as a status can also be imposed on a person or group via institutional, legal, and regulatory definitions. For example, bureaucratic categories such as citizenship, race, and deservingness. Recognition, as we all know, often differs from merely having. Belonging can also be an emotional or affective dimension for the individual, the sense of belonging, including feelings of loyalty and comfort that one's identities are recognized and validated in a place, community, or family. This sense of belonging overlaps with Pater's others' more political approach to the notions of political subjectivities, citizenship, and the ever-expanding list of forms of citizenship, just like we have an ever-expanding list of forms of capital. Finally, belonging act performed when people behave according to certain codes, enacting rights, duties, and expectations. These enactments may be financial, such as remittances, fees, and taxes, and involve decision-making, such as giving advice and voting, presence, visiting burial sites, bodily care of mothers, of infants, the elderly, and the sick, and deployment of symbols through language choice, naming, clothing, for example. Thinking of reproducing belonging, most scholarship of belonging involves men and their use of place-based identification and expansive notions for political and economic gain, as just also for prestige and respect. I focus on families as actors and venues in which belonging gets reproduced and often transformed. I have also, like Peter, Apostolos, and Basile, been looking at these issues in situations of migration within Cameroon and between Cameroon and other national contexts. Where and how does belonging get reproduced? The circumstances of birth and birth conditions belonging and exclusion from mothers and their children. Children play important roles in their parents' legal incorporation. Consider, for example, the figure of the anchor baby. And in their affective belonging, consider how connected mothers feel to a new place. From prenatal consultations through involvement in a school's parent association, children create interactive situations that reinforce belonging in families, communities, and states. In Berlin and Yaoundé, I observed intensive mothering. Mothers create, countering stereotypes of the downtrodden, backward, in need of help, undocumented African migrant. Shortly after returning to Yaoundé from Switzerland, Yvette and Gabrielle coached their 6-year-old daughter to deliver a birthday speech in English and French. Likewise, in Berlin, Barbara turned the German-invented tradition of the school starting party, or Einschulungsparty, into a Cameroonian festival marking her daughter's transition from a carefree preschooler to a serious schoolgirl. Right here, with displays of a decorated Schultüte and Lilifee school supplies. A feast of plantains, chopped bitter leaf, and other delicacies from a nearby Afro shop demonstrated continued long-distance belonging to a home place in the Cameroonian grassfields. Decor, tastes, lingual sounds reinforced guests' conversations, claiming simultaneous binational cultural citizenship. Town associations provide a more public venue in which mothers, in particular, attempt to reproduce belonging their immigrant children. The Synonymous Highlands Regional Cultural Society organizes a monthly Children's Day. The quoting from here. I teach them how to play drums, teach them how to introduce themselves, because most of the children we have here mostly spoke German. I teach them a bit of English, they at least those two languages. The second woman said, I take my child there because I want my child to know her roots. The belonging fostered and rehearsed at Highlands is then performed citywide during Berlin's annual Carnaval der Kulturen, which you see here with the demonstration and the tourist onlooker gaze. Why is such reproduction of often multiple belonging careless? What puts the act of belonging, of reproducing belonging in peril? And why might that reproduction be careless? We can understand the precarity of belonging through the metaphoric concept of affective circuits. Affective circuits are networks of social connection and exchange whose ties and flowing ideas, advice, people, and objects are infused with strong emotions. Like an electric current, flow can be reciprocal or one way, like AC or DC. It can be interpreted and can be interrupted by short circuits. Some metaphoric short circuits are imposed from without, such as migration regimes that separate family members and put pregnant women and new mothers at risk. What my interlocutors repeated, the phrase, all alone, all alone. Other short circuits manage social relations, controlling the flow of information about oneself to deflect demands. Affective circuits show that reproducing belonging is as about disconnection as it is about connection. This is very much in Peter's line of thought. So building upon Peter's work on witchcraft and the dark sides of kinship and belonging, let's take a few brief examples. A difficult migration history caused Sonyo to mistrust those around her, refuse to join any migrant associations, and wait until after giving birth to inform her mother about a new pregnancy. At an association end-of-year party, Mott quickly changes the topic of conversation so that acquaintances who only met monthly wouldn't recognize and judge her infant feeding struggles. Mabuke, a university student who spent her childhood moving between foster care arrangements in Cameroon and her mother's home in Maryland, still suffers from the frequent disruptions in life and her troubled yearning to belong. She says, I recall in the fostering homes I stayed in, I wasn't maltreated, but I wasn't treated as one of the children at home. Now, Mabuke's generation of educated young Cameroonian migrants living in France, Germany, South Africa, and the US circulates through blogs and Twitter new ideas about parenting, kinship obligations, emotional health, largely rejecting their parents' belief that children learn resilience through the hardship of child fostering. Attending to affective circuits helps us rethink social capital. Kinship is not only about solidarity, and social capital is not always positive. Social capital, those networks and the resources embedded in them, comes with perils. Resources such as grandma's advice, local medicines, and remittances come with costs and expectations. The network ties that create and support belonging and social capital are not human. These relationships can be slowed down, dropped, and picked up again. Cameroonian migrant mothers attempting to reproduce belonging strive to create social ties and carefully manage what information, ideas, practices, and material items, and even people flow along these connections. In the current violent iteration of the Anglophone crisis, belonging brings with it perils of unbelonging to the nation. Both Bamileke and Anglophones have long only partially overlapping of unbelonging. Anglophone Bamileke, caught between their Francophone origins and their generations of residence in and identification with the Anglophone minority find belonging particularly perilous. Kwachu speaks to identity issues accompanying physical threat. He writes, for some in Cameroon, you are either Anglophone or Francophone, either a victim or a benefactor of linguistic privilege. However, for citizens of the 11th region, which means Bamileke and Western Grassfields people, who for several generations settled in the Southwest region. So for those from the 11th region who straddle the linguistic divide, the last several months have been a period of considering the complex colonial legacy of their identity. Belonging can potentially increase particularism and political segmentation in Cameroon and among Cameroonians in their place of migration through long-distance nationalism. Conviviality is challenging. To conclude, I'd like to just reiterate that belonging is a complex topic operating in different venues and in different types of interaction, experience near and experience far. It behooves us to examine its dimensions, belonging as both the air or blood of well-being and also the perilous basis for exclusion and violence. Just as Peter wrote about the perils of belonging from the perspective of a political anthropologist, reproducing belonging for migrant parents and their children comes with its challenges and perils and requires a lot of courage and tenacity for cosmopolitan parents. The question remains, whither studies of belonging and whither the second and third generations of Cameroonian migrants? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. Peter, would you like to comment on these two papers?
Yes, I very much would like to comment, but if you allow me just quickly, the papers are wonderful and there's a lot of to comment upon. So I'm certainly back to the two wonderful papers, but maybe very quickly some general points. And first of all, of course, many thanks to Apostolos and Basile for organizing these two panels. It was a lot of work and I'm very touched by your words. I'm very proud that Basile finally pronounced my name. So you did it, very good. That's a very good occasion. And also many thanks to Jan Willem for his beautiful words. Wisdom, I must swallow that still, we will see, but it's always thin. I feel on thin ice. Let me put it like that. I want to make two general remarks on this panel and on my take of belonging. I'm very happy that both papers and also the papers in the next panel take my emphasis on the perils of belonging very seriously. I'm really very happy with that. To be blunt, for me, belonging is a trap. That's the way I wrote about it. It's a trap, and it's all the more a trap because it's there is something interesting with the notion in English. I think in two later papers one for a book on, I forgot the title, on words of crisis, words in time of crisis, keywords in time of crisis. 2017 with Fassin and Vina Das, but the book is still not out. So crisis apparently is relative. There's not that much hurry. But in any case, I did a text on belonging and I went a bit further in analyzing the term. The etymology of the term in English is very interesting. It's being and longing. Longing, it refers, according to the Oxford University dictionary, to a very old way of medieval English yearning. And this makes what's interesting, and I'm really puzzled by that you can't translate it in any language I know. In all European languages, or that I know at least, and even in African, few things I could say. In African languages, it's very tricky to translate it. If you translate it into French, it's appartenance, which is a very boring term. In German, it's Zugehörigkeit. And the interesting thing that in both French and in the Italian version, there is already the negative side. That Zugehörigkeit means also that you are kind of caught, that you're tied. And appartenance is the same. But in English, it has this kind of belonging, it's kind of nostalgic, it's full of emotion and affect. And that makes it a very, very dangerous term. Is this visceral power of the term? That's, I think we really have to take that very seriously. Emma and as Apostolos touched already upon that, it's this offering safety. Pamela quoted Yuval Davis, and she's very, I like very much her book, but I'm always wondering if you talk about safety, you should immediately talk also about unsafety. It promises safety, and in the end, it creates a kind of basic insecurity because somebody else can always belong more than you do. It's kind of and yeah, the other point I want to make, I would have made if I had to rewrite the book, is this kind of strange combination of entitlement and resentment. I think in all the cases I know, autochthony, I know good, I know well. Autochthony is about entitlement. You claim privileges because you're autochthonous, and often these privileges are not granted or not enough granted. So it's at the same time as resentment. And this, if you look at Trump, for instance, it's very interesting that this combination of entitlement and resentment that makes autochthony such a violent, potentially violent notion. And I think all that I found in all these papers, so I love the paper. On George, I go quickly. Apostolos, but you stop me when I take too much time. It's a beautiful title, compliments on the title, but it's also a beautiful paper. Of course, I love the focus on houses, while both your examples made me think very much of the Bamileke area, which Basile and Pamela know so well. Antoine Sokpa, the other PhD student of mine that took me some 5 years ago there, and I had been there, but it had completely changed with these huge castles on hills. So it's exactly what George described for Romania and also for the Samburu. You see, if you approach Bagante, you see this huge castle of what you call the former Fayman. I forgot who. In any case, the house is impressive. It's on top of the hill at a safe distance from the village, and it's exactly. Misty Bastian wrote about it a long time ago already for the Igbo. These kind of empty houses that people are very frightened of, that are haunted by ghosts and all that. And so Antoine writes very interestingly about the kind of change in the balance. That relates also to Roger's paper we will have in the second panel. There is a strong feeling that these external leaders do not contribute enough, and then they are resented. So it's very, very complicated balance. I found so all that is completely in line with what George is writing, is focus on houses. And I found especially valuable the emphasis on temporality. And I think for all the papers, I think it's very tempting to see such house building and such belonging as the unilineal development. The longer migrants are away from the village, the less affect and belonging. That is kind of general supposition. First generation migrants may still want to build a village, but probably second generation will not. George shows very well that it is much more complicated. And again, I recognize that among the Makate group I know best in Cameroon, there was in the early generations were hesitating a lot. There were several cases of elites who really cut with the village, who did not want to build in the village. And it's only in the 90s suddenly that it is, but the Maka used to always to be very angry with their elites because they did not build houses. And there was always the contrast with the Bamileke, and the Bamileke are always migrants behave, and they do build houses in the village, and our migrants do not even build a house. They have to stay with their uncle when they come to the village. But now the elites are building houses. So it is all very situational. For Cameroon, decentralization and democratization encourages building rage, but it is, I love the expression, belonging is never a done deal. That's very good. It reminds very strongly of Sarah Berry's title, No Condition is Permanent, on the Yoruba, and it relates also very, what Sarah writes about some time ago, relates again very well to what you are describing. What's very rich in your paper is the way you introduce sexuality and sex money and the sorts of respectability that makes your paper really opening up new perspectives. I must confess that I was struck also, especially in Berlin, on the sudden presence of Romanian business boys in the 1990s in the bars. That was kind of sudden, all these Romanians there. I never related that to belonging, but you do it in a very effective way. It shows that these kind of daring comparisons do work, and that it does help to put all that in a broader perspective. Okay, that's what I had on here. Quickly, I've still some time. You can, Apostles, you can still give me some time. Pamela's paper is again very, very original and again seminal ideas. What's of course very precious is your combination of ethnography on a Cameroonian setting and in-depth ethnography of Cameroonian context and the diaspora. This combination is really, I'm really jealous of that. It's wonderful. It makes the paper very strong. I liked also very much that I think you could develop that a little bit all at the end. There's suddenly unbelonging in relation to the 11th province, the people of the 11th province. And I think it's a very intriguing example. I'm wondering, probably you have among your interlocutors in the diaspora, both Bamileke who identify with the Bamileke area and people of the 11th province who in fact are often Bamileke, but are they still Bamileke? And I'll come back to that. That's an aspect that could be interesting. And I saw also this status, effect, and performance. It's belonging as status, effect, and performance is very seminal. It's a very useful kind of points, not classifications, not separate, but it's a kind of triangle which very closely hangs together. I love the quote of Brecht, of course. It's wonderful to relate Brecht to issues of belonging in Cameroon. It's great. And I like especially performance. I find it very good that you add performance as one point of the triangle. In my book, all at the end, and I wish I had done more on it, I write about rituals of belonging. I think it's indeed, it's very good to realize that belonging is never a done deal, it's never given. And I think that's also the force of this English notion. It has this natural aspect. So of course you want to belong, of course where your families come from, where you were born, you belong. This is kind of natural. I think it's a given. And I think it's very important to politicize that. Of course, there certainly there is this emotion, but there's a lot more, and the emotion is very situational. People work with it, but the emotion is also, I'm to work with it is not a good example, because the emotion, there is a lot of emotion and a very strong effect. So you cannot handle it just strategically. It's often a kind of effect that also elites who are trying to manipulate or talk to me are often swept off the feet by the force of these emotions, the demand that raises these emotions. So I think so that's why I think performance is indeed crucial, the way it's performed, and again, not the performance is very good, not in the kind of staged, but it's a kind of performance where people deal with the emotions that they have difficulty to handle, have difficulty to contain. It's strong stuff they are handling. I think you're certainly right that I have this gender focus in my work. I'm very sorry for that, but yeah, you very effectively bring in women, and I think that's very good. So the emphasis on reproduction. But I was wondering, you could take it, if it's possible, a bit further by adding funerals. And I think that it's always striking that in migration studies, funerals are lacking. And as far as I know, it's a very big issue among at least the Africans in diaspora. Where will I be buried? Will I be buried in the home village? Where can I attend the funerals of my family in the village and all that? So the funeral is an issue that haunts people. I did a little on funerals, and there then women do come inside. So even in my book there are certainly women, and you're very right, there should be more women. But what is striking, for instance, that's why what came to my mind when you referred to the 11th province, Francis Nyamnyo and I published on this issue for 11th province people that they have to show where their father is buried. And people reburying their father, it goes quite far back in the 80s, 70s. So these 11th province are people who migrated from Francophone Dominican land to Anglophone Southwest province. And they kind of, to flee, their parents fled for forced labor, so the importance of history. And why? Because they fled, they did not bury their father. The first generation of migrants is no longer buried often in Bamileke land. And that means you cannot claim really autochthony. The joke is Cameroon has 10 provinces. Yeah, of course. The 11th province does not exist. There's no 11th province on the map. So they are people without their own province. They are rootless. And one of the questions that haunt them is always, where did you bury your father? And some of them reburied their father in Bamileke area and all that. So there you see when you write about unbelonging, then your funeral looms large there. So that was just some short remarks. Many thanks for the 2 papers, and I learned a lot from them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Okay.
So let's give the opportunity now to our presenters to reply to Peter's comments. George, would you like to respond to Peter?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to say very briefly, I really liked Peter's point about kind of the etymology of belonging, of how belonging can be defined as a longing for a state of being, because in a sense, then it becomes this constant deferral. One never really arrives to that state of being, one can only long for it. And that has really a powerful currency for ethnography, because then what we're looking at is not at the arrival, but the impossibility of arrival. And in that case, whatever the means are, whether it's this kind of house or this kind of a car, or whether it's a funeral or a wedding, can also shift very quickly. And just to add to that, and to the example that Peter, you brought up from Cameroon, thinking about the house and the elites and so on. Even as I give this paper, I'm seeing how so much is already transforming. So compared to the time when I was doing fieldwork in Samburu, now the more modest house is being built in the village to give the impression of status, but not too much status. And actually the big villas are being built paradoxically, I would say, in Nairobi, where they can be hidden, where nobody can know, except probably your driver, that you have wealth of a kind of a more grand stature. Meanwhile, in Romania, many of these houses were left empty because migrants stay abroad longer, and they cannot be rented because nobody really wants to go live in the village in those empty houses. So just in the past 5 years or so, more and more migrants started purchasing apartments in town that can be rented and could make money. So these media also, if we're thinking of longing as this never arriving, as this kind of perpetual quest, desire for a state of being that is yet to come, gives us an opportunity to think of the shifting media, sometimes quite rapidly from one decade to another, of what it means to belong materially, spiritually, symbolically, in all these ways. Thank you so much, Peter, for your comments. I really appreciate them.
Thank you, George. Before we proceed to Pamela, I want to ask our listeners if they have any questions to submit it through the chat. Basil, do you have a question? Okay, let's first give the floor to Pamela, and then you can ask your question. Pamela.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, for your comments, and thank you, George, for the beautiful paper. I wrote some of my comments or questions into the chat because I wasn't sure about my my connection. In terms of the focus on performance, I hadn't actually thought about these three things, performance, status, and emotion, as a triangle, but from now on I will think of them as a triangle. So thank you for the shape. In terms of performance, I think a lot in terms of interaction ritual chains, and not so much of a stage, although I have written about children's parties as a way of performing social class in the Cameroonian diaspora. I did not use any examples about funerals, but wake keeping and death benefits are one of the biggest motivators for people to join hometown associations in Berlin and in Paris, where the ways that people join associations works really differently than it does in Cameroon and the kind of domestic diaspora. It's not as universal. There are some people who avoid it, people who join when they're young, and then as they're abroad for a longer time say, I don't want anything to do with that. Some of them even use language like you used, Peter, about belonging being a trap sometimes. I've only heard one person, though, protest about building houses back home, saying that it was stupid. This was someone who had been in France for close to 30 years and was very critical of fellow Cameroonians building their homes, building these empty villas back home and changing the landscape in the ways that even more than 10 years ago, Basil was writing about. Let's see, what were some of my other questions? Oh, yes, Peter, you talked about the different words for belonging in English, French, and German, and that seemed very, very insightful. It really resonated with me. One thing that I've noticed when I talk about belonging in English, so many people say, oh, you mean sense of belonging. They keep repeating this, sense of belonging, or they would try to improve my language and put this sense of this emotional part as if belonging is only about feelings. And to me, that started to feel a bit reductionist, that belonging is about emotions, but that's one of its appeals and dangers, but it's absolutely not only about emotion. And it doesn't just come from the person seeking belonging. It's not that we're all just kind of supplicants to the god of belonging. Sometimes it can be imposed on one with very violent and even deadly effects, as we know from history. Even a reason why my Romanian ancestors left Romania in 1913. Yeah, so I'm wondering, I have two questions. One for George about the element of time in your work, if you could say more about rhythms of return and that temporal side. And for all of us, I'm kind of interested in thinking about what does it mean in terms of return and belonging if we don't only look at elites, or don't assume that just because someone has fallen bush that they automatically become elite. So those are the thoughts and questions that kind of percolated to the top of my brain.
Thank you, Pamela. Basil, you also had a question?
Yeah, I have two very short questions. One for George and the second one for Pamela. And the first question is to George, and I really enjoy your paper on this politics of home. And I find your connection between Kenya and Romania very interesting, and which is something unusual in the African studies. So this comparative view about different social experiences. So the general question I have is, why is it important for this migrant to go back home? What do they represent in terms of home? And is it only people who have been making that go back home? And what about those who fail in their migration? Do they also go back home? And so Pamela, yeah, that was really a fascinating paper. I find some connection with my own work on the Bamileke transformation of the landscape by migrant from the grass field. So the question is how this imagination of belonging can impact on the construction or on the representation of a space, either as what Isaïe Dogno, I don't know whether you know him, he's a Malian anthropologist, he calls premier chez soi. The premier chez soi, and he constructs with the deuxième chez soi. For him, the premier chez soi is the home country, and the deuxième chez soi is, let's say, the adopted country. In the Cameroonian case, the premier chez soi will be Cameroon, and the deuxième chez soi will be Germany. But the problem is that sometimes some people might turn the premier chez soi into their deuxième chez soi, and the deuxième chez soi becomes their premier chez soi. So my question is, under what circumstances the premier chez soi can be turned into a second choice home, and the second choice home become the first choice home? We see, for example, that is something that's also been performed by the elite. In the paper I wrote a couple of months ago about the ambivalent representation of homeland by the post-colonial elite. They idealize the so-called homeland, but in the daily practice, they tend to value more the Western country than their home country. So that was the question.
Okay, thank you, Basil. I see that we do not have questions in the chat, and we have about 7 more minutes to go. George, would you like to respond to Basil's and Pamela's questions?
Sure.
And please try to be brief, like you have about 3 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, first Pamela, for your paper, which is so inspiring, and as is your work that I've been reading for quite a while. And so thank you for your question. And let me just briefly try to say a few words about time. To confess, I arrived at questions of time unexpectedly at the end of my doing ethnography. As I was trying to see how migrants in Kenya return to their villages and try to produce respectability, time kept popping up in my ethnography. For example, questions started emerging around age sets and age grades, which are quite central in rural areas in East Africa. You know, young men in their 20s who suddenly could pay bride wealth and become elders, while you have so many elders in the area who are lagging behind on paying bride wealth and going in what is now called silen kauti, like the debt of bride wealth that gets inherited for generations because people cannot pay bride wealth. So age became an interesting kind of site of contestation. Then the question of the durability of wealth. Yes, you might buy your way across the age grade and achieve respectability as an elder while you're still in your early 20s, but have you really achieved respectability, or is that kind of wealth like water? It's going to go away very fast. Hence, again, questions about time. Does this kind of wealth that's produced through sex last, or is it tantamount to kind of like distributing money of sex? And therefore, if you feed your children with it, it's like incest. If you feed your parents with it, it's like incest, and therefore it will not last. It will not. So questions of time popped up there as well. Then there is, of course, the notion of progress and modernization that's been so hegemonic in national discourses about time. And the question there emerged, is this kind of wealth, what in Kenya is called maendeleo, is it really development? Is it really progress? Does it kind of like push you forward in time? Or is it kind of subverting progress in all kinds of ways? You have it now, but tomorrow you're not going to have it. You're going to lose it. And you return, as people say in northern Kenya, to the shuka, to the loincloth. You know, kind of like you move from the loincloth to the pants, and now you're going back to the loincloth. So time came to permeate in all these domains. And of course, these different domains like age, wealth durability, questions of collective progress, and so on, come to intersect in all kinds of interesting ways. So this is how I arrived at the question of time. And of course, this has very much is very much animated by the question of return. The fact that you come back raises certain questions about age, wealth, etc. If you stay where you are, those questions will probably be quite different. Thank you also, Basil, for your question about like why go home. This was indeed one of the central questions that animated my at the beginning of my work in Kenya. Why a Samburu, unlike many other young Kenyans on the coast, did not desire primarily to move to Western European countries, and rather decided to move to what are actually quite marginal economically and politically areas in Kenya. And a similar question can be asked about Romanian migrants to Western Europe. And the best answer I have for now is that in a way to produce, and this is also coming out of my interviews, where migrants would say, well, you know, if I was to go in Western Europe, I would do menial jobs. I would be treated very badly. Many invoke racism. Whereas if I go back to my village, I could be somebody. Here, the kind of customary modes of respectability, of belonging, and so all matter in important ways. And I think this also leads to a question that I think both Pamela and Basil raised what happens with non-elites, with those who fail. And many of those in Samburu especially do go home because they have the safety networks that they would never have in coastal urban areas. But they are also renegotiating respectability in new ways. Many are called beach boy elders. You want to be an elder, but you're still a beach boy. You haven't quite acquired that respectability. So for them too, questions of belonging remain central. And I'll stop.
Thank you so much, George. Because we're running out of time, Pamela, would you like to make a final remark or to give answers to the questions that you were asked?
Yes, thank you. I find all of the remarks in the papers and this really really fascinating. Thank you, George, too, for talking about time. I put something in the chat about money as well. Everything starts sparking memories of different people's works and making connections among different places and similar processes going on in different places. So one thing, Basile, when you Basile, I don't see anymore, but hopefully he will come back. So for the recording, responding to Basile, when he spoke about the premier chez soi and the deuxième chez soi, I was thinking about different generations of migrants in two different ways. One is the different waves. This would be the temporal dimension that George was talking about. Migrants who migrate at different times have different histories. They migrate for different purposes because of the history in the home place and the history in the place of migration. Also, the place of migration might change things in some ways. It isn't just all migrants act in the same way. I saw huge differences between Germany, France, and South Africa, while there were also many commonalities among Cameroonian diaspora people. But in addition, there are different generations. So the children of migrants, the 1.5 generation who migrate as small children, and then the second generation, and now in France, at least, the third generation. Germany's not quite so far. They have very different ideas about what their premier or their deuxième chez soi is. And this question that people get, that children get all the time, and adults as well, where do you come from? Just because of the color of the skin, the difficulty of pronouncing the name, either where do you come from, or you speak German so well. I never heard that in France, that they spoke French so well, but you speak German so well. How can you do that? Those kinds of questions really hurt for those who turn the deuxième chez soi into the premier chez soi. And so those are just some ideas that came to the top of my head when I heard.
But if I may, very quickly, is it the funeral the final test? I would say, from what I know from Cameroon, the funeral is the final test. Where you're buried, there you belong. And if you do not bury anymore, sorry, you do not belong. Trends is kind of fixed point. It's kind of, I'm wondering.
Thanks, Peter, for your comment. I am afraid that Pamela will have to reply by email to this question, because I see that we got a message from the technical support that we need to end this session. Thank you so much.
Just one remark,
George and Pamela, and thank you so much, Peter, for your comments. So stay with us. Let's have a break of a few minutes, and we continue with us a pre-recording of his presentation, and he will try to join us for the discussion, and then also Francio Guadalupe. So I suggest that we start with a paper presentation of Nandita. Her paper is entitled "Home Rule: The Making of Post-Colonial National Natives and the Hardening of Nationalism." So please, Nandita, the floor is yours.
Great. I'll just start my slideshow. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Nationalism. So first of all, let me start. I'm a bit flummoxed just because it's so early in the morning where I am here in Hawaii. So please excuse my fuzziness. It's a great honor to be on this panel, and I'm not saying that just as a pro forma part of my thank you to the organizers for inviting me, but it truly is an honor because the work of Peter has been so incredibly useful in my thinking about these issues. So let me start. Nationalism is inherently about separation. As Ben Anderson showed us, nations are not only imagined as communities, national communities are always imagined as limited. No one nation can encompass all the world's people, nor does it want to. Nationalism produces some, but never all people into a people. Nation states are also reliant on naturalizing a link between a certain people and a certain place. Nation states thus require the turning of land. The turning of land, water, and air into national territory. Those included in the nation become a people of a place, or more aptly, a nation with territory. Of course, not all people are a people, at least in the territories in which they live. Thus, nationalism turns those excluded from what Bridget Anderson terms the national community of value into a people out of place. It is the figure of the migrant which establishes the limits of the nation. The migrant is defined by lack of political status, lack of national belonging, and lack of a claim to territorial sovereignty. In international politics, the jealous guarding of the nation's people and its place has become a virtue. Codified in international law, rights within the global system of nation states are only as secure as one's relationship with the nation state whose territory you are on. When people excluded from the heaven of national belonging live in territories imagined as not theirs, many see them to be threatening national security. Ultimately, what they threaten is the security of nationalist identities, something that the national form of state power fosters to normalize its rule. In this paper, I wish to examine a particularly powerful and uncanny aspect of the contemporary politics of separation, the national borders erected between people constituted as either natives or migrants. While those placed in the colonial state category of native were once denied national status, often categorized as tribes or clans not suitably advanced enough for the mantle of nationhood, nativeness today is increasingly seen as the ultimate criteria for national belonging. Those categorized as migrants are, by this definition, quintessentially out of place. Separating people into categories of natives and migrants is no trifling matter. Their separation has and continues to animate some of the deadliest conflicts in our world. Even before mass killings began in June 2012, the separation of people into natives and migrants in Myanmar, formerly Burma, has been the ideological basis for what human rights observers believe is the world's most recent genocide. Rohingya people have been removed from the roles of Myanmar citizens. Their homes and businesses have been looted and burned. Approximately 120,000 Rohingya people have been placed in what many classify as concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have had to flee Myanmar to save their lives. all in the name of the indigenous rights of Burmese Buddhists in Myanmar. In the Darfur region of Sudan, a populist Save Darfur movement has successfully reframed the economic, ecological, and political legacies of European imperialism into a conflict between indigenous Africans and migrant Arabs. In Rwanda in 1994, those acting in the name of native Hutus killed approximately 800,000 quote unquote migrant Tutsis, the most potent and inflammatory label during the Rwandan genocide, and the one that was most often used to describe Tutsis, was that of colonizer. A not dissimilar process took place in the 1991-2002 Yugoslav wars. Ideas of native belonging fueled the claims to Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian homelands. Those people targeted for ethnic cleansing were defined as foreign elements who were out of place in other people's national territories. 140,000 people were killed and another 2 million people were displaced in the process. The ideological basis for the forced expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972 was the indigenization of Black Uganda. Claims to native rights to rule nation states led to military coups d'etats aimed at unseating elected Asian parliamentary leaders in Fiji from the 1980s into the 2000s. Such a politics continues to shape violent, xenophobic attacks on migrants in South Africa, where many of those targeted as outsiders are co-South African citizens, but not members of tribes who have been granted authority over territory and people at the subnational level. Xenophobia also informs white supremacist moral panics over immigrant invasions across Europe and in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Thus, across the world, the legitimization of exclusion pivots around a politics of anti-migration. The politics of separating natives from migrants is also evident in an increasingly popular discourse in the nation states of the former British white settler colonies, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where the white in white settler colonialism has been dropped amid a growing chorus of opinion which asserts that all people who are not native, including those racialized as Black, Asian, or Latinx, are settler colonists because they are migrants. Indigenous activist Sakej Ward has even said that, quote, the label settler is too historically and politically sterile, and that they are nothing less than occupiers. In these reformulations, migrants are held responsible for the colonization of natives. The stretching of the category of settler colonists to include those who were expressly excluded from white settler colonial projects is part of a politics centering indigenous national sovereignty over land. Yet, even though it is land that is invoked, it is national territories which are being claimed through the discourse of indigenous sovereignty. Nationalisms within native nations define battles over who does and does not belong. We can see this in the 1981 adoption of the Ganawage Mohawk Law and moratorium on mixed marriages, or the Marry Out, Get Out law, and in the efforts by the Cherokee Nation to expel Cherokee freedmen, descendants of Black people held as slaves by Cherokees and brought with them on the Trail of Tears to the territories later defined as Cherokee National Territory. Overturned by courts in Canada and the US, these efforts at limiting national membership demonstrate not only the racialized basis for ideas of the nation, but also the continuous process of culling. Although each has its specific historical, political, economic, social, and cultural context, what connects these very different nationalist movements is their employment of a discourse of autochthony in which the figure of the migrant is defined as the barrier to the realization of native national rule. That autochthonous discourses are plausible, that they can do political work in a remarkably wide set of circumstances, ranging from the far right to the social justice movements of some of the most subjugated and oppressed people on the planet, tells us something of the importance of autochthony to the contemporary character of power. The term autochthon is derived from the Greek autos, self, and katon, or earth, literally meaning one who has sprung from the earth, and refers to an original or indigenous inhabitant of a place. Many of the key classical Greek theorists and rhetoricians, Homer, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, all partook in the creation of the myth of autochthony as the basis of claims to rule. Like autochthony, the term indigenous also stems from classic Greek political theory. As Bambi Cupins, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names, as Bambi Cupins and Peter Gesher note, to be indigenous means literally to be born inside, with the connotation in classical Greek of being born inside the house, i.e. being a master of the place. Those constituted as autochthons or the indigenous are seen to establish the limits of the political community. They are said to be rooted to particular lands and as such, the only one with inherent rights to it. This relationship is said to transcend earthly bounds, as this relationship to politics and to place is said to be eternal. Aristotelian metaphysics aside, the production of autochthons is both an historical and a relational practice. Autochthons and their opposite, allochthons, belong to particular kinds of societies. Allochthon is predicated on the Greek allo, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to someone or something else. First used as a geological reference, i.e., to describe rocks, to be allochthonous was to be originating or formed in a place other than where found. In its modern usage, autochthony is founded on the ideological transformation of class into race. It is these associations made most clear in the nationalist transformations of classes into masses that gives indigeneity so much of its political purchase. As Jean Komaroff and John Komaroff have noted, the politics of autochthony or indigeneity is often a politics which appeals to those with very little, sometimes the least, in the nationalized societies they find themselves in. Although I would add that such politics expand and intensify, this too is changing. In any case, the indigenous has come to stand for the impoverished, the exploited, the subjugated race, while their binary opposite, migrants, have come to stand for those who dominate, expropriate, and exploit them. The conflict is presented as one between a people of a place against the people out of place. The politics of autochthony rests on another unacknowledged ideological transformation, that of conflating human mobility with state-controlled migration, and a secondary conflation between processes of migration and processes of colonization. These are what makes autochthonous politics uncanny. Many of those once categorized as natives of various European colonies have become the colonizers, sometimes of Europeans and at other times of other colonized natives. For a growing number of people across the world, migration, real or imagined, today or hundreds or even thousands of years ago, has become tantamount to colonization. I argue that the intensifying centering of indigeneity, the intensification of anti-immigrant politics, and the consequent separation of natives and migrants are integral parts of what I have called the post-colonial New World Order. A post-colonial world is defined by the global hegemony of the national form of state power. Thus, post-colonialism, far from marking the end of the violent relationships of colonialism, marks instead the end of the legitimacy of imperial states. Post-colonialism is not an after to colonialism, and it is certainly not decolonization. Post-colonialism is instead a style of ruling that actively subsumes the collective anti-colonial energies of people into a new separated world order of nation states, and in so doing contains people's demands for liberation. Of course, some of the characteristics of post-colonial politics were formed in the period when imperial states were still hegemonic. Thus, we need to pay attention to the imperial genealogy of the biopolitical categories of both native and migrant. The OED notes that in the late 14th century, a native from the Anglo-Norman naif was a person born in bondage, a person born to servants, tenants, etc., and inheriting their status. At this time, being native was a class position of subordination and servitude, and this meaning of it remained embedded in the imperial state category of native. By the end of the 17th century, other animals and plants also began to be categorized as native. In the late 17th, early 18th centuries, the imperial state category of native was used to designate someone who naturally belonged in some place. They were of the land. Native, of course, was a biopolitical category against which a bourgeois European identity was born. The earliest recording of European, according to the OED, was in the mid-16th century, and it was used to mark people as not colonized. Native was also the imperial category against which migrants were produced. A significant part of making migrants was undertaken in the mid-19th century when in various colonies in Asia and Africa, some colonized people were categorized as indigenous natives, while others were categorized as migrant natives. This bifurcation of the category of native was, as Mahmoud Mamdani has shown, a response to widespread revolts of natives in the colonies. Fearing the collapse of their empires, imperial states, starting with the British effort to contain the enormous upheaval caused by the 1857 rebellion in British India, enacted a form of governmentality known as indirect rule colonialism. Indigenous natives were categorized and treated as more native than migrant natives. Both of these imperial categories were codified, and the two now separated groups of natives came to be governed by different kinds of imperial laws. Indigenous natives were placed in tribes or band councils, putatively led by one of their own, from which migrant natives were excluded. Consequently, the two groups of natives had very different access to land, political rights, and power over one another. Their separation created a competition between them for the stuff of life that continues to shape politics to this day. The basis of the imperial distinction between indigenous and migrant natives intensified the idea that there existed a primordial relationship between a people and a given place. Natives, categorized as indigenous, became natured. They were portrayed as being a natural part of the land and as such defined by stasis. Migrant natives, on the other hand, because they were represented as settlers from somewhere else, they were defined by mobility. 19th and 20th century nationalisms in Asia and Africa took these imperialist ideas and retooled them to fit the nations they were in the process of creating. In the post-colonial New World Order, both colonizers and natives have been remade into national subjects, even as not all those who classify themselves as nations, either in the colonies or in the metropoles of previous imperial states, have been successful in gaining a nationalized sovereignty. In the post-World War II era, being a nation was and remains the thing to become. National subjectivities, Etienne Balibar argues, have to be both essentialized and territorialized in order to, quote, produce the effect of unity by virtue of which the people will appear in everyone's eyes as a people, that is, as the basis and origin of national political power. In this way, all nationalist projects can be said to deploy a discourse of autochthony, thus fixing both national subjects and their migrant others in time and space. National identity is an autochthonous identity, at least in the successful ones. Its key binary is that of national natives and migrants. So to conclude, the principle that those people who could lay claim to being a people had the right to national sovereignty formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations. In its founding 1945 charter, the UN made the right to national self-determination the bedrock of international law. Hostility to migrants was bred in the bone of this UN Charter. With its declaration of the rights of people to self-determination, it would not, nor could it, account for the rights of all those people who are not a people. Because the nation is always a world in, because a nation is always a nation in a world of nations, and each exists in a world prowled by capital, the nationalization of subjectivity requires an explanation not only of who we are, but who we are not as well. For each nation, exclusion becomes a necessity and a virtue. Historical studies show us that as this intensifies, when national self-determination is achieved, Edward Said's comment that, quote, in time, successful nationalisms consign truth exclusively to themselves and relegate falsehood and inferiority to outsiders becomes painfully clear. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nandita. That was a wonderful presentation. And I see also that Basil managed to join us.
Yeah.
So will you take over, Basil?
No, you can go ahead, please.
Our next speaker is Rogers Orok, and he will present the paper, The Politics of Complicity, Elites, Belonging and Development in Cameroon. I'm in contact with him through WhatsApp, but he faces some connection problems. So I'm going to play his presentation through a pre-recorded video. So let me.
Hi to everyone, and I would like to start by thanking Apostolos and Basile for inviting me to this panel. The title of my talk is The Politics of Complicity, Elites, Belonging, and Development in Cameroon. And so the talk is written from material that I collected almost a decade ago, working with political elites in Cameroon within the context of my PhD dissertation research. And during that moment, there was a lot of speculation about the political future of Paul Biya, the current leader of Cameroon, and that speculation was largely related to the fact that he was almost 80 years old and he was due for and led, alongside many other Manu elites in the context of political mobilizations towards the presidential elections of 2011. All of that was meant to show up support for Paul Biya. As a local chief and minister, Peter was therefore a powerful political figure in the local context of the Manu division, as well as in the regional context of the Southwest region. He spent a considerable amount of time on the work of political mobilization, and by the time of his death in 2016, he had attained a significant following as a leading political figure within the context of Manu politics and the Southwestern regional struggles for political leadership. Like most Cameroonian urban elites since at least the 1980s, Peter understood that his political survival as an individual and his claims to political leadership depended largely on two important factors. The first, his ability to play up his identity and sense of belonging among the communities in Manu division, and then secondly, his commitment to mobilizing the Manu in the rural communities and those in the cities across the country towards a common goal of the pursuit of social improvement within the context of the ruling CPDM party. Now, what is remarkable is that Peter is able to do this, this kind of political mobilization overtly on the basis of his ethnic identity. And this is remarkable because about a decade and a half earlier between the 1960s when Cameroon first attained independence and the late 80s, that would not have been possible because for reasons that I will explain in a moment. And so this dramatic transformation in terms of how elites are able to mobilize on the basis of their ethnic affinity and their affirmation of belonging is an important point of departure for me in terms of thinking about what I call the politics of complicity in the post-colony. But even more so, it's important in relation to the role that development plays in the work of political mobilization that elites undertake. And so I draw on some of my observations of Peter Agbotabi's efforts to mobilize the people of the Manu through their ethnic and cultural association called the Manu Elements and Cultural Association, MECA, between 2010 and 2013. Remarkably, Peter did so by organizing a series of town hall meetings across many urban centers in the country. And in the ethnographic descriptions that I offer, I focus mainly on one town hall meeting, which is the town hall meeting in Kumba, and the main urban center in the Southwest region. So the Kumba town hall meeting was held in March 2011, and all of these, as I said, was aimed at mobilizing, meeting, and encouraging and asking the people of the Manu divisions to vote for the leader of the CPDM ticket, who is his boss, Paul Biya. Although Biya is a Francophone and an ethnic Beti and had already stayed in power for 29 years or so, most elites, including Anglophone elites at the time and even now, still supported Paul Biya very fervently, publicly at least. Without any surprise, Biya was handily declared the winner of another 7-year term that he has yet extended in 2018 until 2025. Although elections in Cameroon tell us very little about the popularity of the leader, but the we have to remember that the mobilization of crowds of supporters leading up to those elections remains important to how these elections become wrapped in some cloak of legitimacy. So at his arrival in Kumba, Peter was welcomed by the traditional secret society of the Manyu, the Ekpe. By engaging in these rituals of welcome with the various lodges of Ekpe across these towns, because this was in Kumba, it was not the first time or the only time that the Ekpe, the traditional secret society of the Manyu, is mobilized to welcome him. And so by engaging in these rituals of welcome with the various lodges of Ekpe across these towns, Peter Agbotabi sought to make explicit the links between himself and one of the most visible cultural institutions of the Manyu, the Ekpe Secret Society. These town hall meetings were always organized through the joint efforts of a task force of the Manyu elite within the ruling CPDM in the capital city of Yaoundé under Peter Agbotabi's leadership, and the local branches of the Manyu elements and cultural associations, Association Mecca, in the various towns and cities where the events were held. It was the responsibility of each Mecca branch hosting these meetings to ensure a primary role and visibility for the Ekpe lodges during the welcoming of the minister at these events across the towns. Some of the most prominent actors among these elites included Professor Echu George, who serves as a technical advisor at the presidency under Minister Peter Agbotabi. Others held positions as directors in government corporations or public corporations, or directors of major hospital centers, and so on. This task force team was constituted and mandated by the CPDM Central Committee and the party secretariat to liaise with the local officials at the level of the divisions. This is a typical mode by which the CPDM party secretariat operates between the local party structures that it considers as its basic organs and any Yaoundé-based elites from the various divisions. This mode of political party voter linkages is similar to the way the old National Cameroon National Union operated during the one-party state. According to the intentions of these Manyu elites, the purpose of these events was to support the efforts of Elections Cameroon, the newly established official electoral agency for Cameroon that is charged with organizing and monitoring all elections in the country. At the time, Elections Cameroon, or ELECAM, was confronted with a huge challenge in terms of the low numbers of voter registrations that they had recorded almost 8 months to the elections. And so there was a kind of attempt to drive up the voter registration. And so the elites, the Manyu elites within the CPDM, under the leadership of Peter Agbotabi, felt that their popular town hall meetings the effort was meant to contribute to that project of shoring up voter registration numbers. Besides this, the Manyu elites also hope to raise funds from the Manyu communities across the urban centers to help other poorer Manyu kin in local communities across the area to procure national identity cards that are necessary for such voter registrations. These proposals were in fact a novelty in Cameroon's field of, ever inventive politics. Prior to this, elites had traditionally relied more on waiting for the funds from the CPDM party secretariat to engage in political campaigns. And so Peter Agbotabi's initiative was one of the first in a wave that has since almost been consolidated in terms of elites raising funds from voters in order to undertake party-related activities. Through this initiative, Peter sought to achieve a highly visible mobilization of the Manyu elite in favor of Paul Biya's candidacy and take credit for providing effective political leadership. Now, Peter Agbotabi's activities are, in my view, instructive to some of the questions and debates about political mobilization and the role of elites and post-colonial power in Africa that we have seen in recent discussions by within the works of people like Bayar, Peter Gesher, Achille Mbembe, Richard Webner, and most recently, Wale Adebanwe. In my view, the complex work of political mobilization that elites like Peter Agbotabi undertake become important to understanding the kind of authoritarian political context in Cameroon. I am particularly interested in the intersection of belonging, the popularization of expectations for social improvement among local communities, and the role of elites in political mobilization. And so for me, a political figure like Peter and his project to mobilize people towards the vote elections in 2011 is an important vantage point from which to understand how this intersection happens. Development, it is said, according to Apadura, is an expression of cultural aspirations for recognition and inclusion. It encapsulates desires for social improvement. And what is interesting in this case is that what we see is that for a long time before the political moment of political liberalization in 1990s, development discourse was monopolized by the state. But in a context, changing context after 1990, what we see is that elites have been able to occupy important spaces within which they can appropriate development discourse in order to pursue political projects of their own. And largely, and I think which is a remarkable point I would like to end, is that they do so by also exploiting their affinities to their ethnic communities. And this is a remarkable change from the past. As Peter Gesher says, in African regimes aspire to total control over development with varying degrees of success, of course. But what is interesting in that is that after the 1990s, the kind of impediments for elites to undertake such mobilizations on their own terms were eviscerated by the change, the switch towards multi-party politics. And suddenly, what is remarkable is that elites like Peter Agbotabi can begin to undertake mass mobilization events within which they become suddenly very visible. And I think it opens up interesting questions for debating the ways in which the fusion of development, the politics of identity and belonging, and authoritarianism work in kind of creating the atmosphere of social intimacy of tyranny, according to what we have come to know of regimes, authoritarian regimes like the Cameroonian case. Thank you.
Good. So now, last but not least, is Francio Guadalupe. The title of his paper is different than what appears in the program. He will present the paper Exploring the Nation Through the Lens of Baseball, a popular culture perspective on national belonging in the Dutch Caribbean. Francio. Francio, sorry, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, there we go. You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. Good afternoon to one and all, and everyone who's tuning in via the wonder of internet and digital technologies. I see this conference as a kind of ode, and not only this session, but the entire conference is an ode to Peter Gesher, or Peter Gesher as I call him, because to my mind, no one has written so incisively about the question of belonging, about the perilous effects of belonging when it is understood as being too wedded to the administrative categories of states. So what I'm going to do is, inspired by Peter Gesher, I'm going to question that notion of belonging, and I'm going to put it into conversation with a conceptualization of popular culture coming from Stuart Hall. And I will be focusing specifically on baseball and the Dutch Caribbean islands of Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, St. Martin, St. Eustatius, and Saba. So to me, the question of the nation and the question of belonging is necessarily the question of the world after empire. It's about the afterlives of empire. So when I think about the Dutch Caribbean, and I think about the Netherlands as well, because I think many social scientists make that mistake, they do not recognize that instituting decolonization and decoloniality, not the same thing, in the Dutch world was actually a federal process. It was not a process of nation states, but it was a federal process in which the Netherlands in the 50s became one of the constituent states of a transatlantic polity, which nowadays consists of the Netherlands, Aruba, Curacao, and St. Martin as constituent states. And the Netherlands itself has 3 overseas municipalities in the Caribbean, which are Bonaire, St. Eustatius, and Saba. Secondly, you need to recognize that at least almost half of the Dutch West Indians live permanently in the Netherlands. They plan to die in the Netherlands, be buried in the Netherlands. So the question of belonging and burial is not an issue that plays itself out, with this group. So there's about 300,000 and about 160 to 180,000 that live in the Netherlands permanently. These are not new Dutch. These have been Dutch for a very long time. If you take the Bataafse Akte, and Peter is a historian, so he knows it better than I. If you take the Bataafse Akte, which is kind of like the pre-constitution of the Netherlands, which came about in 1789, it already included the peoples of these regions. So it said in Dutch, the Joden, the Blanken, and the gemanipeerde negers and mulatten. So all those people who were free on those territories, so the Bodem principle, the territory principle, were included in being Dutch national subjects. And you see that in 1863, when slavery was abolished, it included all. And then you get the afkomstprincipe. This is a legal category where blood became important. It also, at that moment in time, also said everyone born on those territories are also Dutch citizens. Now, because we're dealing with the afterlife of empire, we need to recognize that there's democratic deficits, there's questions of power imbalances. All these things matter, but we also need to recognize that the Dutch Caribbean troubles the notion of Europe being only located on the mainland. It troubles the question of national belonging, it troubles the question of history, and it troubles the question of citizenship and nativism. If I'm being clear, I think that there are instances in which one recognizes that the Netherlands is not only a place, it's part of a federation. And those instances are instances when popular culture comes to the fore. So in popular culture, when you think about the Netherlands, oftentimes people say soccer, and the players of soccer reminds people in the Netherlands, and I guess in France the same, and in England would be the same, and Germany would be the same, that there is an older colonial history. Many of the players in the Dutch soccer team have Oryx Surinamese extraction. And we're going to have the European Cup in a couple of days. On Friday, I for sure will be watching, and I think some of you will as well. But when you look at popular culture and you think about baseball, then baseball reminds you that the Netherlands is still part of a federation of constituent states. And when you think about baseball, you recognize that when you look at the wealthiest and the most influential sport players in the Dutch world, most of them are baseball players. Of the top 10, you have 5 that are baseball players. And then when you think about it, in the top 5, you see that 3 of the top 5 are baseball players. And these are baseball players with Dutch Caribbean roots, many of them playing in the Major League Baseball in the US of A. Now, what would it mean if we take baseball, and then I'm riffing off of much of Caribbean studies, CLR James did it for cricket. What would it mean to look at the Dutch Caribbean islands from the perspective of baseball, like he did from the perspective of cricket? How do we trouble Dutchness, and how do we also trouble Dutch Caribbeanness? So both. I think the perspective of baseball illuminates these 5 points. It eliminates the question of contemporary migration, because many migration scholars only think of migration heading to the North Atlantic, but they forget that large-scale migration that takes place also in the global majority. I don't call it the global South anymore, the global majority. There's also the historical movement, which is a longer trajectory of migration. Sorry. There's also the issue of Caribbean traditions of imagining national communities, because these things can be specific, even though they have universal valences. We would have to look at popular culture in Stuart Hall's understanding of simultaneously a site of struggle, a site of entertainment, and a site of commerce, and a site being cultural practices and expressions. And lastly, the dialectics of particular capitalist flows, and these are the flows of commercialized popular culture. They do not admit any easy national closure. So it's not only that national belonging is always open, it is also that you have a capitalist world and capitalist dynamics that make it impossible to have full national closure ever. So briefly, because I know we are, I have to take 15 minutes, as Apostolos said. So if you look at contemporary migration, then you notice that on these islands, if you take St. Martin, one of the constituent states, 70% is newcomer from the 1960s onwards. And these are people from all over, from India, wider Caribbean, Latin America, and so forth. If you take Aruba, you notice that about 45% will be newcomers. If you take a place like Bonaire, the majority of the persons living there were already born elsewhere. So these are transnational communities, and transnationality is recognizing social fields that are being created in the places of residence and the places of so-called origin of these populations. These are transnational countries, and I think the Caribbean generally has lots of transnationality going on. Secondly, this is not new, because when you look at these islands, you recognize that up until the 1950s, they housed the largest oil refineries in the world, and therefore their population catapulted. So from 8,000 to 50,000 in 30 years, or from 30,000 on Curacao to 100,000 in 30 years. So you have an older movement of people coming and going, newcomers entering, changing the dynamics of the countries. But of course, this older movement is not sufficiently recognized. Now, Peter Gesher always says that autochthony is an impossible universe. There's always coming and going. And the national story is to actually try and curtail that coming and going. In the Caribbean, and there you get the specifics of national imaginations of community, you have Creole nationalisms. And Creole nationalisms, what they do is reroute the question of belonging into a recognition of ethno-racial pluralities. So Creole nationalisms in the Caribbean and some parts of Latin America, they will always say, we do not start pre-colonial. We start in the colonial period, and then we recognize that there were people who came from various parts of the globe. So they will say, out of many, one people, people from Africa, people from Asia, the Amerindians, people from Europe, we are one people. In that Creole nationalism, it generally speaking will say one group will be more privileged than the other. So it will recognize plurality, and it will say that's the face of the nation. And you see on Aruba, one of the Dutch Caribbean islands, it's all the faces of the world. That's the face of the nation. But Creole nationalism cannot handle the newcomers. It can't handle time, because Creole nationalism starts in a particular space. So it says, let's say the 1800s, then we became a people, or the 1900s, then we became a people. And then it presupposes that those people remain and the so-called cultures remain as is. So you will have lots of newcomers, but it cannot necessarily incorporate them. And the reason you can't see that it's not incorporating them fully is because Creole nationalism is based upon ethno-racial or ethno-cultural pluralities as constitutive of what kind of nationalism we're talking about. Now, enter popular culture, because what popular culture does, being a site of commerce, a site of struggle, and a site of entertainment, it is that space or those types of practices that will contest Creole nationalism and contest the politics of belonging that go with that. And with baseball, you notice that baseball entered the Dutch Caribbean with the Americans who came with these large oil refineries. But it also entered the people from the Spanish Caribbean who had experienced baseball earlier. And thus, on the island, baseball became that space to struggle for justice, for recognition, and these types of things. And interestingly enough, most of the baseball players that are on the top of the league in the US, from the X-Man Sander Bogaerts to Andrew Jones and so forth, all of these are persons who explicitly mention, I am transnational. I'm a Ruben, but my family is also from St. Martin, my family is from elsewhere. So they push that transnational card and therefore trouble the notions of the nation. And when you look at the newcomers that are entering right now, and you look at the working classes or the working poor, you notice that their children will be actually the new groups that will enter this arena of popular culture, which is not a nice arena, because once it's a commercial, when you look at its commercial face, you have to look at outer nationality, and outer nationality are ambits of operation and styles of being that only have a limited relation to the nation state. It has to be able to exploit and export whatever is considered important in particular nation states. And therefore, you get a different dynamic of constantly making sure that closure never happens. Now, I think that we should perhaps use popular culture to question the politics of belonging on the other side of the Dutch kingdom, in the Netherlands. And lastly, I'm doing so in a new book, which I dedicated to my Roman Grande, as they say in Papiamento, Peter Gesher, and that book will be out in 2022, and it's really specifically looking at the Netherlands. So while I did not speak about urban Blackness and that conception, that's what I'm going to be doing in that book that's coming out, and this is another project, Troubling Sovereignty and Nation States in the Caribbean. Thank you. I'll stop there. Peter Gesher considers a gift, and then a gift in the most positive sense, because I know you can see the ambiguities always. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Francio. And thank you so much also for keeping within the time limit. Peter, would you like to give comments for these 3 papers?
Yes, I'd love to. Yeah, I'm not muted. Okay, most interested to give comment. Roger still did not join us?
I just messaged him. He's still struggling with his connection.
He's at the Johannesburg airport.
Yeah.
He's a nomad, the poor guy, so he will have difficulty getting access at the airport probably. But yeah, let's hope he can join. Okay, great papers. I was wondering, the people who gave these papers did attend also the first session, or so I should not repeat. No, you did not. Okay.
Not all of it. Not all of it.
Okay.
Just a little part. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, the first session I made some general comments. I said I was so happy that all the papers emphasize perils of belonging, not belonging as a given. There was George's characterization of belonging as never a done deal, so never really given. And I think that's very important to emphasize the complexity and the danger of belonging. So I said that belonging was a kind of trap, and that especially the English notion. And I think these papers do the similar things. The English notion of belonging is very special because if you try to translate in any other language, it does not work. This combination of being and longing makes belonging a very mobilizing, give it a very powerful effect. It's a very emotional term, and it's very difficult to control it, and it speaks to people. I think what's very important for these papers also is what George said in the first session, that this combination of being and longing makes it always a kind of ideal and unattainable. Is it unattainable kind of dream almost? And that gives it this powerful effect. And I think it's very important also for these papers. I said also that it was wonderful that Basile and Apostos organized this session, this double panel. So thanks a lot to them. And great that Basile is again with us. Cameroon is really doing its best these days with Wi-Fi. So to Nandita's paper, I'm really so impressed that you got up in the middle of the night for this conference. It's really, and it's really wonderful to meet. I must immediately read Home Rule from the Jan Willem's intervention. I don't know if you heard that. Jan Willem Davender intervened in the first session. He was very proud that you were on this panel. And he said he immediately, he had read your book Home Rule already, and I have not. So I'm lagging behind, but I should read it immediately. I'm very, it's a great paper also, so it makes me really want to read Home Rule. For me, the originality of your paper is that you deftly relate the idea of localized belonging or talk to me to the nation. Kind of lift us all up to a next level to the nation state. This idea of yours, the post-colonial new world order as a global framework of nation state. Nation state is very, very strong and I very much like the way also you showed that the idea of people out of place, and it's a kind of very powerful expression, people out of place, and that it has a long history. In the first session, we discussed several German examples. In Germany, you have this expression Aussiedler. Aussiedler means people settled outside, which were the people who were forced to move after 45. All these people of the German part, what became Poland and even Russia, they all moved, and there was this Aussiedler is a very powerful notion. It relates very well to what you were talking about. There is a lot of contempt in it. And what is very striking is that, I mean, of course, they're all Germans and we should receive them very well and all that. But Aussiedler is kind of, there was some discrimination. And you see it again with Aussies and Westies. So after 1990, the East people, the way they were received by the Westerners. So ethnicity is not only there in Africa or this kind of discrimination, it is very much in the heart of Europe. And I think you make a very good, interesting point, contrast between empires opening their borders, inclusivist, and nation state closing their borders. That's really a very important point. Although I'm also tempted, also in relation to Francio, the empire was not very kind to these minorities. I mean, they dealt in a different way with minorities, but not necessarily in a better way. But there is indeed a very, very interesting contrast. as far as border is controlled. And maybe in relation to that, in relation to your paper, there's very interesting work by Francis Nyamnyo and Jane Geyer on a kind of African notion of the border, which is the African notion of the frontier, which is very different of the American notion, the border as porous, the border not as closure, but border also on the, hello, Rogers is there. That's what, that the border as a place of exchange, of a kind of plurality, and Jane Geyer is very good in showing that thresholds in the circulation, so borders create value in African context. So I'm wondering whether that's interesting in relation to your paper, this kind of alternative view of border and the way it plays out in it's difficult. I mean, on the other hand, there is certainly the border as a kind of closure and a kind of papers and police and all that, but there is also another idea of the border as a kind of creating value, creating exchange. I must confess, and I think that would be maybe interesting for the discussion, that I'm a bit confused by the deftness with which you lift autochthony is belonging to the level of the nation state. In the cases I know well, Cameroon, Netherlands, autochthony is seen as intention with the name, with national citizenship. It's not, it's different. It's a kind of alternative way to belonging, which are more or less in competition. But I like very much the way you show how shifting categories as native, nativism, indigenous, that they can shift from quite positive to quite negative, so that there's constant. So it certainly works in your paper to relate autochthony to the level of the nation state. I was wondering, on the other hand, in many contexts, the context I know well, autochthonous and indigenous is a kind of, as a double notion. It is the Dutch, when they refer to themselves as autochthones, they are always laughing a little bit. It's a kind of with irony, because autochtone in French, autochtone is very, very negative, very pejorative. It's rustic, it's stupid. So you could kind of talk in general about the contrast between autochthony and allochtones, but you rather not identify yourself as an autochthone. So I was wondering how that relates if you talk about nation state as autochthonous, if there's still some left over of this ambiguity of the notion of autochthony and belonging. On the other hand, what is very interesting might be in relation to your paper is the example of Nigeria. Nigeria is very, follows its own course inside Africa in this respect and in many other respects. So in Nigeria, all the federated states each had their own, people were proud to be a native of the federal state. Each federal state had its own dominant ethnicity. They were the natives. Later on, the native has also very, as you show, very pejorative meaning in English. So they changed it to indigenous. So they have a completely different notion of indigenous than the idea of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous People. So there is a lot. I think that's also very interesting in your paper on the shifting meanings of categories that seem to be given. So thanks a lot for your paper. I learned a lot. For Rogers, I'm not sure that Rogers is hearing us. He doesn't make.
Yeah, he can hear us.
Maybe he hears us. Yeah. But he switches off his camera. Oh yeah, there he is. Okay. Hello. Far out in the VIP room in the Joburg airport, probably. I think it's a seminal paper, and again, and by the way, you link a discourse of belonging to a discourse of development. This relation of belonging and development is very, very important for in many African contexts. But I find especially the way you link it to complicity is very, very intriguing. And I'm wondering whether it's possible to do a little bit more with complicity. The way you link belonging to development is very is seminal in the sense that has parallels elsewhere in the world, because it's very important to highlight a shift in what I like to call post-Cold War moment, but notion never caught on so much. But the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, you see a very big shift, development as statist, development through the state. In the 80s already, shift to bypassing the state and reaching out to society, civil society, and all that. And that has crucial effects for these notions of belonging. So I think what you show, it could be even stronger if you focus on the terms that people used before 1990. Autochthony was a dangerous word. You would never use the word autochthony. A good friend of mine in Makaland ended up in the 70s in jail because he talked about autochthony, and autochthony was the language of subversion, and you could only speak about national citizenship. Any reference to tribal differences or local differences was anathema. Already in the 1990s, the autochthony appears in the constitution, in new not autochthony, indigenous, appears in the new versions of the constitution. So this is really a huge change around 1990. So I think your paper relates very well to the emphasis of George's emphasis on temporality. You see again how belonging is not a kind of eternal given. On the contrary, in the 70s, for a high politician in Cameroon, it was very dangerous to talk the language of belonging. You could be accused of subversion by the one-party state, and you would end up in a concentration camp. Many cases of that. So you see how much belonging. I think it's again very important that you highlight that shift, because you see it's not a kind of natural thing. Of course, it's always there. It is there sometimes. Sometimes it can express itself very differently in very different contexts. But I wonder whether you can do more with the notion of complicity. I like it a lot, but it remains a kind of open in your paper, what complicity between whom and whom. And it might be interesting to relate it to Achille Bembe's emphasis on connivance. Is it? Yeah, but it could be also somewhat differently. So I'm really interested, and it's really this linking of development and belonging makes for all sorts of unexpected complicities. Your example, all the more your example of Abu obliging the people of his, the other elites of his group to pay up, to contribute financially, it's unthinkable in the 70s. In the 70s, the one-party state made this kind of, maybe just, I'm sorry, I should be quick, created a lot of competition within each group. So each group, the regional equilibrium, each group was entitled to 2 or 3 posts at the national level. So the competition was inside. You could never compete with somebody from another group, because if he tumbled, you would not get his post. But you should compete with the guy from. So you would never contribute to make Abu Dhabi stronger. On the contrary, you would do everything to make him fall, so that you could. So you see how these patterns can change very, very quickly, and all that is very important for belonging. Sorry, I should be quicker. Francio's paper, as usual the Caribbean diffusing all the categories we like to work with. That is, the Caribbean is always the end of, the beginning of everything, and the ends all things that have in hand. Also, because Francio presented a quite different paper from what he sent to me on the internet, so probably, but still, I think there are certainly correspondences. What is clear is that Francio does not like the notion of belonging. That's quite clear, I think. And Francio does not like the notion of nation state. Oh, well, maybe the notion, but he doesn't like nation state. He doesn't like nationalism. And so I'm impressed that you managed, nonetheless, even though you don't like these two notions, to present not even one but two papers, more or less, of, that are very relevant. I'm really impressed by that. I regret that your beautiful ethnographic vignette disappeared. So people have not, maybe they have seen it, maybe they've seen it. Has everybody seen the written paper he distributed? No, but there's a beautiful vignette when the paper comes out. You should read that. That's ethnography, Guadalupe style, a very special kind of ethnography. But very, sorry? Somebody said, no, but it's you should consult it. You should read it. I thought I love what you do with baseball, and again, it's very confusing for me. I thought, oh, baseball, that's a kind of a parallel for me, at least, to football hooligans in Europe as a ritual of belonging. In the book, I use that example. I try to understand if the funeral ritual, the funeral in Africa, at least for the Maka, is really a ritual of belonging. If you have danced and mourned for 3 days, then you know where you belong in the village. And I try to find similar rituals of belonging in the Netherlands, and I could not find any. So I ended up with football hooligans, and there is some sort of belonging. So that's the parallel to baseball, also, if I understand Francio right. But the implication is immediately different, because for Francio, baseball is outer-national. So it is precisely, it's opening up to the world. It's not at all about closure, it's about opening up to the world. I was really impressed by Aruba and Curacao being hotspots of baseball stars. I had no idea. That shows the Dutch neglect of their former colonies. I plead guilty, and I'm very impressed by that. But I was wondering if I read the paper, and I think it's also the paper I could read, but I think it's also in your presentation. There is some sort of message that precisely popular culture as a place of struggle, entertainment, and commerce. And commerce is the one that really solves, that really bridges internal differentiation, that really brings people together. So do we have to read it then as if capitalism is the solution? To quote C.R. James, so it's impossible that it is the solution. But then what is the solution? I mean, there is a question here. Commerce is what brings these people all together on the baseball field and solves all sorts of threatening conflicts. But then, well, it's a question. I'm wondering about that. My other question would be, you do not like belonging, but Miss Cynthia. Miss Cynthia, Miss Cynthia, what is she saying about belonging? I think I'm not sure she agrees with you. And even your famous baseball star, Andrew Jackson, is very remain faithful to Brievengat, from where he comes. So would he agree with your reluctance against belonging? I think I've been far too long, but these would be my questions. But thanks a lot for a fascinating paper in which everything is somewhat different. The lesson we have to learn.
Thank you, Peter. So that was really beautiful. We have about 10 more minutes. Roger told me that it's difficult for him to respond to comments, to talk to us, but he does listen to our conversation and he will stay until the end. So I would suggest that we divide that time between Nandita and Francio to respond to Peter's comments and questions. And if we have some more time, then we may take some questions. So Nandita, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for reading my paper. I'm really thrilled to think about your eyes on my work. It's very exciting to me. So, I think that you're right that the actual term autochthonous is not necessarily the term that people identify with. But I think that therefore we have to pay attention to the emergence of the term indigeneity, especially in the 1980s through the United Nations process, how the United Nations facilitated the identification of indigenous across the world. Because indigenous is an interesting term. Like I'm thinking in relationship to the United States and Canada, indigenous is a new category that's treated as an ancient practice, right? There's lots of talk about indigenous knowledge, indigenous practice, epistemologies, ontologies, etc. But indigenous also is a term that leads out of a particular post-colonial context, right? And I think what indigenous allowed people to do is to make claims, right? To stake a claim to something is what that category indigenous allowed. And I think that that's the category that was used across the world, right? That was, instead of autochthony, it's really indigenous that has gained a lot of purchase across the world, right? So in Burma, the Buddhists imagine themselves as indigenous. In India, Hindus imagine themselves as indigenous. In France, like when we think of Marine Le Pen's discussion of the native French, she's thinking in regards to that kind of idea of indigeneity, right? That there's some group that is of this place. And the reason I related it back to autochthony is that I think that we need to pay attention to the roots, the colonial and imperial roots to contemporary formulations of indigeneity. That, indigeneity is both not ancient, but it's also not new, right? It's mediated by state formations and by particularly by European imperialism. It's autochthony is obviously older than European imperialism, but European imperialism with its category of the native really gave it a different purchase. And now we've got the category of indigenous, which is not the same thing as native or autochthonous. So I think you're right that we need to be very careful about the terms.
Just one remark to confuse things further. The United Nations Working Group on Indigenous People declared that the French translation of indigenous is autochtone. So now the confusion is huge, because in Cameroon you have two kinds of autochtones. Autochtones in the definition of United Working Group of etc. So you see it relates very well to your point. Yeah. So the confusion is fantastic.
Yeah. And just one last point, that within the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous People, there has been a lot of conflict about who really is Indigenous and who is not, right? This is also really fascinating, which is that very strangely, right, like in the rich world, right, Indigenous people in the rich world, in the United States, in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, have argued at the United Nations that there are no Indigenous people in Africa, right, for example, right? Because in their imagination, indigenous people in Africa have gained state power, have gained national sovereignty. Therefore, they're no longer indigenous, which is a very bizarre, another weird twist to the imagination of what is indigenous. Indigenous basically means to lack national sovereignty is what makes you indigenous, right? So it's a very complicated term, and I agree with you that a lot more work needs to be done on that.
Thank you, Nandita. Francio?
I guess that's my yeah, okay, I'm on. My cue. Correct, Peter, I do not like belonging, and I don't like the whole nationalism and nation states business. It seems two different papers because, of course, it is for an edited volume. So what I did was present some of the ideas of the introduction of that edited volume that with a set of historians that are troubling the notion of let's look at the legal constitutions and then think about these categories that were easily used of autochthone and allochthone in the Dutch kingdom. Now, when it comes to the protagonist or the persons in the ethnographic piece that I sent to you, Miss Sinti, who I did not get a chance to speak to, but I'm sure that she 100% believes in belonging. I am unsure whether Andrew Jones does so, because for Andrew Jones, it's more a question of, to a certain extent, almost emulating, and that's the outer-national part, emulating the idea of always actually giving back to your community. That's something that these superstars necessarily do. They don't live there anymore. They probably won't be buried there anymore, but there is a notion of always giving back. So there is something which, and it's not Curacao, it is a particular community and necessarily an act and a performance that these persons do when they're there. So it's not exactly the same thing. Your more substantive question is the outer national moves of this cultural kind of cultural capitalism. That is an important thing. I think in the paper, what I show is that entertainment also mattered. Entertainment and conviviality was about breaking the boundaries. That's the entertainment value of baseball, when all the peoples come together and they necessarily enjoy baseball and the teams are as they are. So there's an entertainment dimension to popular culture, and that entertainment dimension plays a role for sure in, it is a separate set of practices because then you have an audience. And some people in that audience, although I did not see that in the Dutch Caribbean, but I know that there are baseball hooligans in the US and so forth. I think there, and in the Netherlands, interestingly, there are hardly any baseball hooligans as well. So interestingly, hooliganism in the Netherlands is connected to soccer, but far less connected to baseball. And in the Netherlands, baseball is this space where people come together, and it has this commercial thing because it's linked to the outer national. In the Caribbean, similar. Let me just stop there because I'm sure there's other people who want to come in, and that's fine. And I saw Pamela put something in the chat as well. So let's just open it up. Yeah. But thanks, Peter. And you'll be reading all these chapters. Don't worry. Whenever I come in, I hang out with you. Yeah.
You're muted.
I say I'm not so sure if we have time for additional questions, but let's try and see if they stop us. So I think that Pamela would like to ask something.
I'm just interested, first of all, thank you to everyone. These were really wonderful papers. I'm just interested in what people's next steps are. Like, what's the next project on belonging?
May I start? So I'm really interested in the way that we have come to understand what colonialism means. And I think that if you look at most dictionary definitions of colonialism, and certainly its common, usage is its relationship to foreign power. And I'm very fascinated by that, like how, because it has had such influence in shaping the post-colonial world, right? And if post-colonialism is about national self-determination, right? That complication of like, we are now free because we are no longer governed by foreign powers has been a very, very important aspect of how the post-colonies are governed, right? Each of them always evoke the foreigner that is still threatening the nation, right? Still limiting its self-determination, right? Whether it's the United States, whether it's the IMF, whether it's, whatever, it's always used as the alibi for further nationalizing the polity, right? So it, and therefore allowing the present day rulers, who are now supposedly the same people as those that they rule over, an easy excuse to not be accountable for their own actions that they are responsible for, including, of course, signing multinational trade agreements, working with the IMF, et cetera, right? So I'm really interested in, is colonialism, can we imagine colonialism as actually defined by its practices of expropriation, exploitation, subjugation, rather than who is ruling, if the ruler is foreign or not foreign? And therefore, can we reimagine what decolonization looks like, other than just getting rid of the foreigners?
Thank you, Nandita. I'm afraid we'll have to stop it here. I would like to thank all panel participants who so kindly accepted our invitation to participate in this panel.